This evening. We're so glad that you're all here. We have a special treat tonight. We have Dr. Joseph Miller with us, and he's going to be speaking on how Darwinian thinking fails the test of reason. We are all affected by Darwinian thinking in so many aspects of our lives that we probably don't even realize that. And certainly in the sciences, it's had a huge impact, both the natural sciences, but beyond that into the social sciences and the physical sciences. So by way of introduction, Dr. Joseph Miller earned a Bachelor of Sciences in Architectural Engineering from Pennsylvania State University and a MDiv from Oral Roberts University and a Master's in Science and Religion from Southern California University, and also a Doctor of Ministry from Biola University. And if that wasn't enough, with all that education, he's earned a ThM and a PhD in ethics from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So I have to say that Joe is probably one of the best educated people that we've had. And certainly that's a long time in school. So we're so glad that he's going to bring that knowledge here to teach us tonight. He's taught higher education for more than a decade and worked in pastoral ministry for over 20 years. He's also authored multiple books on leadership, church history, and biblical theology, and currently serves as assistant professor of Christian Worldview and Christian Worldview On-ground Lead in the College of Theology at the Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona. So Joe, thank you so much for being here. Before we turn it over to him, I would like to ask that everybody stay a little bit later after Joe's done, because we have some important announcements and discussions about our chapter. And that will be after he finishes. So Joe, thank you very much. Turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Fun story about when you say, all the education and that sort of thing. Sorry, my dog is missing me, so this is Juju, so he gets to be a part of our meeting today too. So, you talk about that. And when I was planting a church in Washington, I lived in the state of Washington for 12 years. And one of the things I did there was I was planting a church, and I had finished my my DMin at the time. So I was, but to make ends meet while I was planting, I ended up working at the local Safeway because I figured that was a good place in a small town to kind of meet a lot of people, because everyone kind of had to go through the one grocery store in town. So I always used to kid as like I was probably the best educated toilet cleaner and dairy section stocker they had ever had. So education, it comes in handy for important jobs like that. So it is what it is. But yeah, so I appreciate the time. So right now, as I mentioned, I'm teaching at Grand Canyon University. I teach Christian Worldview there. And I have been involved in higher ed for about 10 years and involved in pastoral ministry for 20 some years. So my approach to all these stuff, given the diverse kind of educational background and both the pastoral side and the academic side, I want to try to approach these topics and bring a lot of complex ideas down as to an understanding of like, why do they matter? Not just in an academic sense, like to compete for ideas, but trying to get across the ideas like they make a difference in the way we approach conversations, the way we deal with people, there's a lot of assumptions, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that go into our thinking that we're not even just aware of. And so that's what I kind of wanted to bring today, just some of these assumptions that underlie this Darwinian thinking that has kind of seeped into our science and in the culture. And we can see where that maybe has, come in different areas as we start to apply these ideas. So I'm going to share my screen here. And there it is. Make sure I share sound. I got some good sound for us. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Okay, there. Perfect. All right. So Darwin fails the test of reason. I'm going to talk about 8 fallacies embedded in Darwinian naturalism. So in this kind of talk, the way I approach it is, a lot of times I said Darwin thought or Darwin believed, Darwin think, Darwin's thinking. Sometimes I'm looking specifically at stuff he said. Other times I'm looking at the broader sense of Darwinian naturalism. That is the idea of animal to human evolution, the tree of life, the way we evolve lower to higher species, and naturalism being the exclusion of God from that transaction, right? All nature explains nature, and that's the nature of what I'll talk about as well. So that's what we're going to look at. So sometimes I'll say Darwin, and you can always ask, but a lot of times I'm looking at more the philosophical worldview that he employed and that gets used today when we do science. Okay, so that'll be my framework. And let me start with this. Sorry, I had to close that door because it get loud. So here's Darwin's one long argument. The Origin of the Species was his book, and we'll look at the title of that a little bit later in one of our sort of logical fallacies or errors that he made. But his whole idea was it was one long argument for his idea. And his idea was that the species, whatever that might mean, was inexplicable on the theory of creation. He felt like the idea of creation couldn't possibly explain the diversity and all the sort of things we see in nature, the fight for life, the struggle for existence, especially was key there. But the sort of the struggle we see to survival, the extinction of species, all the diversity was better explained or fully explained really by his idea of natural selection. And so we can unpack a little bit what that later is, but I'll just kind of hold off on that idea for now and just kind of say that's what his idea was, okay? So again, the creation theories can't possibly explain what we observe in nature. And this led to a lot of, I think, erroneous conclusions, but his assumptions going in were also deeply flawed in a lot of ways. So his first one we'll look at, Darwin assumed that a logical possibility was evidence for a physical actuality or a physical reality. And so what do I mean by this first thing? Well, just to define a few terms, logical possibility, it's the ability to mentally picture something as real, even if it's not observed. Okay, and so a physical actuality, it's constraints upon the physical reality confirmed through observation. So in the physical world, we realize, hey, I observed this, to somebody says, oh, I did a certain thing. I say, well, that's impossible. I've never seen that. It couldn't possibly happen. But it doesn't mean we mentally can't imagine things. And so the best illustration I have, I'm going to go old school right here, back to Michael Jordan days and Larry Bird when they were doing commercials for, I think it was McDonald's here, and they would do these impossible shot commercials. Check one of these out. That's great.
What's in the bag?
Lunch. Big Mac, fries.
Play you for it.
You and me for my Big Mac?
First one to miss watches the winner eat. No dunking.
Get in there.
One knee.
Which knee? Get in there.
Off the floor, off the scoreboard, off the bank board, no rim.
Over the second rafter, off the floor, nothing but net. Through the window, off the wall, nothing but net. Off the expressway, over the river, off the billboard, through the window, off the wall, nothing but net.
Okay, so that's the idea, right? That's obviously logically, you think, oh, if I can imagine in my head, somebody comes up with this idea. What if that was possible? That'd be so great. But it's funny because we know there's no physical actuality. That can't happen in terms of the physics, but we can imagine it. So sometimes we as humans tend to think like, if we can imagine it, we can do it, right? If you can dream it, you can be it. We have all these ideas. You can become anything you want to become. And that sort of idea of, I think, therefore I am, that I can create my own reality sort of shapes philosophically the way we do it. We look at our culture and our world, and I think Darwin was highly persuaded by that sort of thinking. So here's an example, to give another a written version of, aside from the video. So it is logically possible for a person to imagine an infinity of numbers between 1 and 0. So I could take an infinity of numbers between 1 and 0. But the error here is that no person can actually count to infinity. I could never achieve that. I could never count it. I could never actually point my finger and get to every one of those imaginary numbers that we say exists between there, right? Well, the same thing, here's what Darwin really said. He says, it's logically possible. And when you read his work, you'll see the repeat of the words. Matter of fact, you need a digital copy of his Origins. You can kind of search for possible, probable, likely, just words like that, these sort of fudging kind of words. He'll say it's logically possible for Darwin to identify an infinity of small transitional forms over long eras between the first organic life and the humans. So he imagines that there's these sort of infinity of tiny changes that take place over time. And if you get long enough, if you get enough time and chance come together, if you have enough of these small incremental changes, you can explain the existence of all current life, even from the simplest forms of life. That's his tree of life concept, right? We all started with a single-celled, so to speak, existence, and complexity came over millions and millions of years. The error in that thinking is that neither Darwin nor any scientist today has really observed this infinity in nature. This idea that there can be this massive number of things, we just don't see that take place, at least not to the degree that it can explain the major transition between one form and another. Matter of fact, Darwin acknowledged this. He said, now he uses the word like probability here, which philosophers would, he means possible, but it's not even probable in his case. But he was just dealing in this sort of sense of theorizing. Again, it's his imagination at work here. He said, in considering transition of organs, it is so important to bear in mind the probability of conversion from one function to another. Right. So it's just, let's keep in mind, I know this sounds wild, but hey, it's possible. It's probable. I mean, it has to be, again, because of some of the worldview assumptions he put in, there has to be an explanation, and this must be it. But again, he commits this error of thinking that the logically possible is a physical actuality. The second idea that Darwin looked at is that Darwin affirms the consequence. Now, I'm going to go a little philosophy here to kind of, if anybody's studied some philosophy or some thinking, this is an argument that's a valid form of argument. So in philosophy, we say if something is valid, that means if number 1 and number 2, if the premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then number 3, the conclusion must be true. It always follows that form. But even if the form is valid, you can have an unsound reasoning. Well, in this case, the form isn't even valid. Okay, so in this case, there's a problem with the second premise, and this is why it's called affirming the consequence. So if it's raining, which is P, that's the first part, then the streets are wet. Q is what we'd call the consequence. So if P, then Q is the form. So the Q here is the consequence. But the second premise, the streets are wet, therefore it's raining, would be the conclusion. But that's false. And if we did some imagining together, we can imagine, well, okay, if it's raining, the streets are wet, therefore it must be raining. Well, we can think of a million reasons why that's not true. Maybe somebody, their swimming pool like exploded in their backyard and it's just all flooded the streets, right? A sewer main erupted. A street cleaner came through. Somebody was watering the front lawn and the hose got sprayed all over. So because this follows an invalid form of reasoning, it doesn't hold up. Okay, it's not even a valid structure. It's called affirming the consequence, where the second premise affirms the Q part, and that doesn't prove the P part. Okay, so this is Darwin's way of framing this sort of thing. If God does not exist, P, then all life must come from unguided natural selection, Q. Q is the consequence. So he begins with the idea that there is no God, that this creation can't explain the reality of what is. Therefore, what must, it must there, if it's not God, then it's unguided natural selection. Well, then he, in 2, affirms the consequence. Natural selection, that time plus chance formula, happened in the deep past, even if we don't find proof of it today, right? It's like, well, we can't always find proof of it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this natural selection happened in just our deep, deep past. So he affirms that Q is true. Therefore, we know that God can't be the explainer. There is no God. God can't fully explain this idea. Okay, so that's one way the argument gets framed even today, actually, in a lot of literature and thinking. And you're having conversations with non-believers or atheists or some other, groups of people. This type of argument will come up. It's not the only way. There are other better framings of this that certainly would be more robust. But I think Darwin commits this error, and a lot of people still do today. All right. And by the way, because we're doing Zoom, it's a little more challenging for the interaction to happen live as we do each point. So please do take a note. If there's a question that comes up on any of these points, we'll go back to those. We can bring back the slides. We'll do whatever to, if you need a better explanation or some more details or examples, okay? It's just I find it a little bit challenging on the Zoom side because I can't, when I'm presenting, I can't see everybody's faces and I can't gauge what's happening in the room. So third, Darwin denies the antecedent. So this is sort of the opposite. This is another way the argument sometimes gets framed. So some people say, well, here's an example. If you behead the king, that's the antecedent, then he will die. You won't behead the king, therefore the king won't die. And we can see why this is a problem. I mean, if you're saying, okay, if you behead the king, he'll die, that's true. But if you refuse to behead the king, P, if you're affirming the negative of the antecedent, right? You're saying that won't happen, then therefore the king won't die. Well, that doesn't affirm the consequence because, there's other reasons he could die. Well, one, he's just a human being. He will eventually die whether you behead him or not. Somebody else could behead the king. Somebody else could stab the king. There's a lot of reasons why that won't, that structure here, affirming the antecedent, doesn't work, okay? So Darwin does a similar thing here. If God does not exist, then all life must arise from unguided natural selection. God does not exist. Therefore, natural selection must be true. And so this is another way that same kind of argument goes. It's very different, and but it still follows this invalid form. Now, the reason I do both of these is because I've seen both of these in the literature. I've seen people argue these. I think it's more common to see, like, internet and interactions, or just in conversations, people kind of make these statements and they don't realize that these are logically invalid. And a lot of Christians, when we don't see the form of these and how it's wrong, we get a little confused. Like, we start arguing the details. We start arguing with the wrong things. We start giving evidence. Well, what about this evidence? Whatever. But no evidence matters if the logical structure is invalid to begin with, because when the structure is invalid, the reasoning is unsound. There's no reason you can give when somebody who's being unreasonable, in other words. Okay, so you have to correct the sort of invalid reasoning structure before you can even begin to discuss evidences. And so that's why those two logical errors are really significant, I think, in conversations with folks. All right, number 4, Darwin's argument is self-refuting. And I think this is something maybe some of you have seen specifically. And by the way, especially in this one, it's not so much Darwin's argument here I'm just talking generally that Darwinian naturalistic framework and people who advocate for that. So, but here's the kinds of argument that we see. Here's a claim that I've heard. Claim 1, science cannot say anything about God, and therefore any scientific theory which incorporates theological statements is false. This is the idea that, Christianity is, anti-science. Or if you believe in God, or if you say God created, you're not positing a scientific theory. Intelligent design, that sort of thing. Oh, if you're positing an intelligence to explain, then you are violating good science, right? So this is the claim. Science can't tell us anything about God. If you're trying to bring God into it, you're corrupting science. Okay, so that's probably the most common one we hear. But this is the other claim that, when you read and have enough conversations, people will make this claim. Science shows all organisms have imperfections. This is one of Darwin's actual arguments. So all organisms have imperfections. Therefore, science tells us that God must be eliminated as a creator designer. This argument gets passed around a lot. The idea that, well, if you look at the imperfections, why would a good God create recessive genes? Or what about this disability or that, or this sort of, the idea when junk DNA was still a thing, that can't be the possible, that's evidence against God, right? There's so much junk DNA. There can't be a God. He wouldn't have created all this junk, useless genetic code. So here's the problem. Look what's kind of gets snuck in. Can both of these claims be true? Well, they can't, because notice what happens. Claim number one is saying science can't tell us anything about God. If you try to smuggle God in, you're being anti-science. The second claim is, hey, we're making a scientific observation, and that can tell us something about God, namely that he's not real. Well, they're both saying the exact opposite thing. So which is it? Science says nothing about God? Like, can I make scientific observations and make a claim to an intelligent designer? Because atheists are willing to make a claim that they see imperfections, says that proves God doesn't exist, and that is scientific. But if I make the opposite claim, I'm unscientific. So we can see how there's a clear conflict between these claims that happen. And I've been in conversations with people that, you address this first problem and people address it, and then they'll just shift to the second argument. I'm like, well, hey, just like 5 minutes ago, you're making the opposite claim. And so people make these claims of convenience without even recognizing that they're self-refuting, that they've actually undermined their own ideas and claims. So, I'm willing to deal with people who make either claim and say, okay, let's not make self-refuting claims and let's have a dialogue. But once people start doing this, then you realize you're having an unreasonable framework for an argument, because they're claiming as true two things that are in direct conflict. Okay, so let's do that. I'll ask you guys, do you want to pause at this point and do some Q&A on those first ones, or do you want me to finish up and then we'll do it all together? Again, I can't read the room. I always hate the Zoom thing because I can't read the room. I can't see the expressions and know if I've lost everybody or nobody, or if you guys, this is too slow, this is too fast, I can't read it. So I'll ask you guys what you want to do.
Joe, let's pause for just a moment. We have one question here at least.
Perfect.
Hey, this is Jim Merrill here. Question on your third one about Darwin denies the antecedent. Could you go back to that slide?
Yes.
If you don't mind anyway.
This one right here, right?
Yeah. Okay. So when it gets to the stuff on the right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oops. I gotta bring all the way up here.
So
okay. Yes.
Okay. What I'm confused about is in number one on the right side, if God does not exist, that's P. But
yes.
Then God does not exist is minus P on number two.
Well, it gets to a double negative, and I've been trying to say, how do I make this the right structure to make sense? So I'm struggling with that a little bit. But yeah, so technically it's the claim. I'm affirming in a negative way. So so P is God does not exist. I'm affirming God does not exist, which isn't really God does not exist. So it gets a little awkward. So I'm up for suggestions on making it a better framing there, but that's the only way.
Okay, that's fine. I just thought maybe I was missing something there.
No, you're not. It's a little wonky. It's not exactly perfect, but it's the way the argument is basically structured, but it's hard to kind of make it perfect because when people colloquially use these arguments, they're not trying to put it in this perfect formula, but this is essentially what they're saying, even if I'm I struggle, I think, to perfect it and how to do
Oh,
that.
yeah,
So,
I've definitely seen that. So, okay, thank you.
yeah. Okay. No, I appreciate that question. I've gone back and forth on that one. Like, okay, how do I do this?
Okay, Joe,
Yes.
my name's Cliff. Just to confirm what you said, there's a current scientist who's very popular, and he was asked, "Do you believe in God?" And his response is, "Scientists cannot use God or look at God; that it's unscientific."
Yes.
And so he's very adamant about that. And yet, this same scientist, in when the Carl Sagan series, the Cosmos or whatever it was,
Oh, yeah.
when it came back in the first one, he made a statement at the end of that. He said, "Evolution is not a theory, it's a fact."
Yeah.
Now, the fact is, it's not a fact. But if we assume it's a fact, like you're saying, then everything else, anything else can follow consistent with that.
Yeah, we'll touch a little bit on the circular reasoning to some of this sort of thing that happens for sure. But yeah, we end up with wanting to do both of those things at the same time and we had a lot of self-refuting claims. When you start to see them, and like when you see them written down, you start to think about them, you start picking them up pretty quickly. It doesn't take long. I mean, I've read journal articles published in peer-reviewed journals, from Harvard, science PhD guys, and you can find in the first, paragraph self-refuting claims, or where they're doing this sort of stuff, any of these 8 things that we're talking about, but they don't see it because from their worldview, they don't see the problem. They just say it. And so our hope is hopefully as we have dialogue with people who aren't that far committed to it, but are struggling, especially young Christians who are struggling. If we can point out these things, then we can save them from feeling like they need to jump off the ledge, and abandon their trust in God. So that's kind of, that's the group I really try to think that can be easily most reached with these kind of things. So any more questions on these first ones, these first 4 for right now? We can come back to them too. I just, like I said, it's the Zoom things make it hard. So, okay. All right, let's jump in then with number 5. So Darwin commits what I call the science of the gaps fallacy. There's also a version of this I'm thinking about where it could be the scientist of the gaps, which I'm clearly trying to mirror here the God of the gaps argument, where God is posited to solve things. I think sometimes we can do either. Science becomes the filler, or sometimes the scientist becomes the filler, the replacement for God. And we'll see how this kind of works out. But I'll just stick with one of the science of the gaps for right now. So I actually pulled this up from NPR. They had an article. This one goes back to like 2015, 16 here. It says, what the God of the gaps teaches us about science. And they're going back to Galileo and all these sort of arguments. But here's what it says in the opening paragraph of this article. God of the gaps. When God is invoked to fill in the blanks in scientific knowledge, an old-fashioned and doomed theological approach, but one that is nevertheless very much alive in the minds of many. So dismissing any claim to God, of course, they deem as God of the gaps. But it's like, hey, if you don't know something, then you fill in that lack of knowledge with God. Now, there is a legitimate thing where God of the gaps is a bad, it's not something we want to commit. And Christians can do this in our thinking. But I would, again, throw in the idea that intelligent design gets thrown into this, but I don't think ID is a God of the gaps argument. In fact, it's not a God of the gaps argument because it it clearly avoids that sort of filling in an absence. As a matter of fact, it's taking knowledge we do have and making an inference to God, which is not filling in a gap. It's actually making a logically deduced conclusion based on the evidences, right? But again, a lot of times atheists, agnostics, whatever, will just throw in, oh, if you mention God, that's a God of the gaps. But that aside, notice from here, where God is invoked to fill in the blanks, right? That's the gaps in knowledge. So if you're making a claim to God to fill in blanks, that is a God of the gaps argument. That is a bad form of argumentation. But the problem is when you read Darwin, he does the same thing with science. He says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? So again, he's looking at the world. He says, look, we have all these geological strata. We have all here. My claim is that we should see this infinite, movement of one thing to the next. Why are we missing all these intermediate links? Why can't we find them? Why is there nothing that's consistent? And he says, well, the explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfections of the geological record. So he says, well, we can't find the evidence of these intermediate links because the geological record is incomplete. He talks about the oceans, how the waves have eroded a lot of these strata over time. And so, of course, he said, so basically his argument becomes, and the fact that there is no evidence of these intermediaries is proof of my theory that it's true, because we would expect not to find these evidences, and when we don't find the evidences, therefore it makes sense that they're not there. So therefore, sort of my thinking comes true, right? He's taking the absence of evidence, which he actually claims in his work is a bad way of thinking. Yet he does that himself. But that's why I'm saying it's the science of the gaps. The other thing he also argues is, at times he'll say in his writings, hey, we don't have the evidence for this now. We can't find it, but I know someday in the future, scientists will discover this thing and show that it is true. And I like to include that one because I still read this in the contemporary literature. I still read this in the scientific journals. Hey, this is here. There's clearly a gap here, but we know once we improve our technology, there will be some scientist someday in some future who fills in this thing. Well, how do we know they're going to fill it in? Well, because we know what we're saying is true. That is truly a God of the gaps argument. It's a science of the gaps argument. Science can explain everything, but I have a gap in my scientific knowledge. Well, science must explain the gap. But that's not scientific thinking. That's that same fallacy that gets committed by Christians when we insert God without reason. Same thing happens with scientists when we insert science without reason, or scientists, like, we trust in, oh, well, some wise, brilliant, I'm just not smart enough to know the answer yet. Once I figured out that, sort of, I will figure it out someday. We inserted ourselves in that position of God. In other words, we will fill in the gap. Okay, so that's sort of a big one that happens a lot when the writing comes. And again, there is a legit critique, and we can come back to this for Christians and how we commit a God of the gaps fallacy in our arguments. We have to be careful not to do that, but not give into the idea that all references to God immediately invalidate our argument as unscientific. And in most cases, I think atheism commits this fallacy by too many a priori assumptions. They make these assumptions going in, and then they're willing to fill in the blanks of their gaps of knowledge falsely with hopes about a future. Okay, number 6, Darwin's gambit ignores the mounting evidence. So Darwin's gambit, this is one of my favorite ones. I wish it could be my last one because I just like to end with this. Is such a great one, but it doesn't make it good for last one. So I kept it at 6. So how many of you have seen the movie Dumb and Dumber? Raise a hand or nod a head. I'll try to see who I can see there. Okay, so this is an old Jim Carrey movie, and he plays a guy who's really dumb. His name is Lloyd. And so Lloyd's gambit is what we're going to see in this little clip, right? And Lloyd's gambit is going to be a mirror of Darwin's gambit that I'll explain. So Lloyd is this really dumb guy. And so in the movie, the premise of the movie is this. He and his friend, one is dumb, the other's dumber. You can watch the movie and decide which is dumb and which is dumber. This is the folk, the sort of cult classic that everyone argues about which is which, right? But they see this beautiful woman leave her bag next to a trash can in the middle of this busy area. And they go and Lloyd is like instantly in love with this woman. And so he goes and he picks up this bag and he sees just, like $1 million or whatever it is, just a ton of money in this thing. And he thinks, aha, this woman left her bag by accident. I will so he chases her across the country to return her bag full of money to her. Well, what he doesn't know is that was left for a ransom for her husband. So they've ruined the ransom, but they have all these adventures across the thing, going across the country, and they're spending all their money as they go. It's just, they're not really doing smart things because they're dumb and dumber. But this scene we're going to see is like at the very, very, spoiler alert, it's the very end of the movie. Lloyd is meeting this girl, Mary, for the first time. Now, Lloyd, again, remember, he thinks that they have this great relationship. He's in love with her, and, you know, he's come all this way to see her, and he just wants to know, can they have this relationship? Well, you have to understand that the husband is recovered. The kidnappers are caught. So she's back now, reunited with her husband. And she's never seen this man before in her life. And by the way, he ruined the ransom drop-off, and he spent almost all of her money. So there's a lot of reasons why she's not a fan of this guy at this point. And so here's the exchange, and Lloyd wants to know, what are the chances that they could have a love relationship? So kind of watch this for a second.
What do you think the chances are of a guy like you and a girl like me ending up together?
Well, Lloyd, that's difficult to say, and we really don't...
Hit me with it. Just give it to me straight. I came a long way just to see you, Mary. Just least you can do is level with me. What are my chances?
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Okay, Lloyd's not getting it, right? He's like 1 in 1,000, more like 1 in 1,000,000. So you're telling me there's a chance, right? When I do this one in my college class, a lot of my freshmen, of course, only like 3 of like 100 students have ever seen this movie, but most of them kind of get the humor that's going on. And I look around and I always say, you know, I can tell which of you women have had, which of the girls have had this conversation in high school with a guy. And he just doesn't get it because you're laughing like, oh yeah, I've been there. And the guys that aren't laughing are probably the guy that thought the girl said he had a chance, and they just don't get the humor because they're like, yeah, of course, he's still got a shot. So do I, right? Because the guys who don't pick up on the humor are Lloyd, right? Essentially. But that's Lloyd's gambit, right? The odds are getting worse, but no matter how bad the odds get, he still thinks, so you're saying there's a chance, right? It's not impossible. And so this is what Darwin's gambit really is, to disprove Darwin's theory, because right, they put the onus on you have to disprove him wrong, but to prove him wrong, you have to prove that there is no possibility, 0 chance ever in history, all throughout deep time, of a perfectly chance series of infinite and slight modifications producing complex organs. Right? That's essentially what he's saying is like, you say, well, I haven't seen that now. Well, but you might. Okay, well, I haven't seen it yet. Well, yeah, but you can. We just have to have better technology, or we'll discover this eventually. So no matter what evidence you leverage against Darwin's theory, that it just seems like there's always like, but you're telling me there's a chance kind of mentality that comes out. And here's some examples of where this comes out. So I take Darwin here. He said, by the way, that image of Darwin is actually I took that from a cover of a French magazine back in the 1800s. Darwin's ideas weren't very popular amongst a lot of people to start with. And so he's being sort of mocked on this French magazine for his idea of, you know, human monkeys type thing. So I just like that. I like the image. Great artistry there. So I like the colors too. So that's fun. But he says this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. Right, so this is that sort of idea is like, well, if you can find any, I haven't seen it, so it's not possible. What about the deep time? Well, I can't prove that it didn't happen. So there, he's putting that idea of, well, you got to prove it can't happen. You got to show it's not possible. Well, that's proving a negative we know is not really a possibility. So he's asking us to prove this negative. But here's the problem for Darwin. You know, in his day, it's like he's Lloyd and he's saying, you know, he's saying my chances are 1 in 1,000. Well, today, you know, it's more like 1 in 10 billion. but there's still, a whole group of people who, are Lloyd saying, so you're telling me there's a chance, right? So this is just some headlines. From the modern synthesis to the inclusive evolutionary synthesis, an Einsteinian revolution in evolution, right? So the details don't matter so much what this is about, except that you can find many, many headlines. You can find whole conferences dedicated to this idea that the modern synthesis just doesn't work. It doesn't fit the information. And the call for an Einsteinian revolution in evolution. In other words, we need a radically new theory to explain the evidence. In the meantime, we're not going to give up on evolution. We believe it's true, but the theory itself has failed us. So now we need a new theory because the old theory failed, but we're not giving up on the theory. So it's sort of this arguing both sides of it at the same time that you see in a lot of things. So here's an example. This is the big leaps, which Darwin said you need, incremental, small, long epochs, not big leaps. Well, the evidence are that big leaps do happen, and that actually explains a lot of the things that he claimed were evidence for his theory. So this study of Darwin's finches reveals the new species can develop in as little as 2 generations. So they actually went and did an actual study, not just the theoretical study that Darwin did and the speculation based off of bad reasoning, but they actually did a real study, and they said, this is what the quote, researchers previously assumed that the formation of a new species takes a very long time. Well, why did they assume that? Because it's Darwin's flawed reasoning. But in the big bird lineage, it happens in just 2 generations, according to observations made by the Grants in the field of combination with the genetic studies. In the field of Grants. So this is this idea here. Is he's saying, look, there can be no big leaps. It's all small changes. Well, researchers are astounded to discover that the evidence isn't evidence. But that's, okay, well, now you're saying that the chances are 1 in 2 million, right? So the odds are going down. But then we can look at all of this radical shift that's taken place in the last decade, really, on horizontal gene transfer. So, this headline, just, I can pull it from a million headlines. Horizontal gene transfer accelerates genome innovation and evolution. So now it's, again, it can happen rapidly. It accelerates the genome innovation and evolution. So that it can't get rid of the theory, even though the evidence is against the theory, even though horizontal gene transfer is actually not predicted by Darwin's, and it actually undermines some of the timescales and a lot of the tree of life ideas that he'll bring up, but yet it is still called upon as in a sort of very ad hoc way, where this is why we need the Einsteinian revolution, right? We can't give up the theory, but we're just going to keep adding an explainer and an explainer and an explainer. Then we get epigenetics, which is another key thing. It says, here's the headline of this article, again from Molecular Biology and Evolution. It's time to admit that genes are not the blueprint for life. Epigenetics has been, the last 10 years has been created a huge problem for Darwinian thinking. Matter of fact, it's funny because with epigenetics, and we can talk a little bit about this later if somebody has questions, but it's funny just the shift you see where back in the day, it was Darwin had one theory, a guy named Lamarck had another theory to explain stuff. Lamarck's ideas lose out, Darwin's win. And so Darwin's ideas have held sway since, the middle of the 19th century. But it's funny because now with epigenetics and what we've actually discovered with our gene studies is we realize that Lamarck's ideas were actually probably closer to right than Darwin's. Now you have it like, I think it's Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember which one. They've got a Lamarckian society. They have a whole society dedicated to Lamarck's ideas and unpacking those for the modern evidences. Well, 15 years ago, you would have been as, kicked out as much as a Christian who said, I believe in special creation of one Adam, Adam and Eve. And, that was anathema. that long ago. You couldn't align yourself with Lamarck without being laughed out of the academy. But now all of a sudden, with these new studies, we realize there's these competing ideas are better, but yet we still claim to follow Darwin's thinking. Another evidence is missing junk DNA, right? This junk DNA, this is talking about a specific, this junk, quote unquote, DNA makes up 8% of the human genome. It's absolutely crucial to our lives. Now, it's only talking about 1% here. Don't worry about the percentage. All I'm trying to say is this popular, mechanics article is what it's dealing with is the fact that evolutionary theory predicted that a high percentage of our genetic code must be junk. It's going to reflect all these millions of years of deleterious, negative, or useless mutations that were not necessary for the survival of the species, right? They were unfit. So we find all these broken junk genetic codes. And this was the prediction. Well, now we're realizing that a lot of this DNA that we thought was junk is actually significant. There's a huge percentage of it that's significant actually in fetal development. And it seems like there's some genetic processes that take place. The DNA is encoded to function through the developmental process, and then it sort of like maybe deactivates, if you will, at certain points. But it's not junk. It's useful for a point, but now it's, the human has developed past a certain point, and so it seems to just go dormant or it's not used. We don't even know, really, to be honest. I think there's people still having lots of competing ideas that wouldn't agree about what that means. But here again, another prediction from Darwin is just completely wrong. And so now Darwin's gambit, we've gone from 1 in a million to 1 in 2 million to 1 in 10 billion. The odds get worse and worse, but we're like Lloyd, just keep hanging on. Matter of fact, there are some people, though, making a change. This guy's name is David Glertner. He had a published article. Now, I put this quote from Time because it's pretty significant. Time magazine said he's an artist, an author, a scientist, an independent thinker. He was this brilliant guy as a professor of computer science at Yale. But then he wrote this article and he became the dumbest man at Yale instantly, right? He was a brilliant, brilliant man, stubbornly independent. And then he was a fool. Why? He says this: there's no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances. It's talking about microevolution. Even then, I don't think he actually fully explains it because we have horizontal gene, other things. But okay, fair enough. His idea does explain to some degree changes within species, right? Changes in fur density or wing style or beak shape. To some degree, he explains those things. Yet, there are many reasons to doubt whether he can answer the hard questions and explain the big picture, not the fine tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones. The origin of the species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain. All right, and we write this kind of stuff, and you go from, again, the most brilliant guy at Yale to the dumbest guy at Yale, who people call for him to be canceled because his brilliance led him to the wrong conclusions. But that's kind of the way that one works out. All right, a seventh one here. Darwin undermines scientific reasoning. I've worked on a version of this for an article length kind of thing for a while. I've never kind of pulled it together. But, the idea that, Christianity is the enemy of science. I actually think atheism might be the real enemy of science. And someday I'll be able to maybe write that out in a more formal way in a big picture argument. But for now, it'll work for my presentation. Here's it, at least by undermining scientific reasoning. And here's what I'll just make it an appeal to Jonathan Wells, part of Discovery Institute. He wrote this in Forbes magazine not long back. I think it's 2018. He says, before 1859, science meant, and still means for most people, testing hypotheses by comparing them with the evidence. For Darwin and his followers, however, science, quote unquote, is the search for natural explanations. And this is where your comment from earlier comes in, where they assume only natural things. But science is the search for natural explanations. Such explanations should be plausible. That is, they cannot blatantly contradict the facts, but instead of being based on evidence, they're based on the assumption that everything can be explained materialistically. right? And so this is where Christians, I think, make the biggest error, is that they'll say, well, you know, I need to be successful in the academy, so I'm going to adopt what they call a methodological naturalism, right? Where my methods of science are only going to tell me what, you know, I'm exploring the natural world, so I can only take natural methodologies and natural things to explain natural consequences. But philosophically, I still believe Jesus, God, all that kind of stuff, right? But the problem is, and I think there's some good philosophers that have made arguments about this, that you can't really have methodological naturalism without philosophical naturalism. That is, you're making an ontological assumption that only natural causes can explain natural things. So even for Christians, we're trying to compete on a methodologically natural playing field. But to do that, we have to give up our ontological assumption that God is real, that God could explain some things. And we can do that without making God of the gaps arguments. That's possible. We don't want to commit that error, but we don't have to be materialist in our thinking or in our science. But when atheists do this, when they employ this sort of philosophical naturalism, they're undermining science in a very fundamental way, because they exclude the possibility of a whole realm of possible explanations that they're not even willing to test. And they don't test them because they have a prior commitment to the rejection of God, which goes back to my first argument, you know, when we talked about the rejection of God from the start, right? Well, this leads to this sort of practice, okay? So that's the seventh one. The eighth one, Darwin trusts and morally flawed reasoning. Now, this is a whole talk I do on its own, sort of, does Darwin fail to test compassion? And I look at this historically through a lot of different lenses. But I included it in here because, one, I think it's a fun sort of peek into that other conversation about atheism and moral commitments and science, and what that sort of happened in Darwin's time and what that has looked like today. But I do think there is a flawed moral reasoning that's equally bad as the others. So here's the original title. We all say Origin of the Species and the means of natural selection. Or his other title is Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So what Darwin does in his, you know, Origin of the Species by means of natural selection, or by means of the preservation of the favored races for the struggle of life, he's making two arguments at the same time, and both of these arguments are intertwined in his writing. And the argument is predicated on an Enlightenment view of race and racial superiority, specifically of white European racial superiority. And he uses that cultural expectation. He uses that, you go to thinkers like Kant and Hume, who wrote little bits here and there about this stuff. But you see philosophically where this sort of gets built in, where we're not just different kinds of humans, or we are just kind of whatever, but now we're different distinct races of humans, and some races are superior to other races. Then Darwin sort of takes that cultural commitment and he says, aha, I can trade in what the culture accepts as true, and then he leverages it as actual evidence. So one of the reasons why his ideas were accepted was because many people believed his argument for racial superiority. And here's the way Darwin did it. He said, lastly, this is in a letter. You read his letters, and this is from 1881, so much later on, and he's trying to persuade this gentleman of that natural selection explains the world around us. And he says this, lastly, I could show that the fight and natural selection, right? The idea the fittest survive, having done and doing more for the progress of civilization than you seem inclined to admit. So he's saying, look, I think this natural selection is proved by the British system, and he'll say it here in a second, the colonialist, imperialist system where we've conquered these other inferior races. This is his argument. He says, remember what risks the nations of Europe ran not so many centuries ago of being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous such an idea now is. Why? Because they've shown they are superior, more able to adapt, more fit to survive. Says, quote again, the more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at not very distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. And he says, look, so, you know, the fact that the Europeans overcame this threat from these uncivilized lower races shows that natural selection is true. It shows that only the fittest can and do survive. So there's something in us, the white European, in our civilization that proves the evidence scientifically that we are the superior race. And eventually, all of these lower races will be forced into extinction because we, just like, you know, millions of species went extinct in the past because they could not survive. They were not fit to survive. These lower races are not fit to survive. And the evidence will be when we conquer them and when we take over India or all these other places, like he's pointing to that and saying, look, see, this is why we conquered it. It's evidence that my scientific reasoning is sound. So I'd hope, and when I include this last one, by the way, my hope is that most people today would realize that that's really bad reasoning. That most, even atheists would say, okay, that's really flawed. Oh, science today wouldn't say that. But that's not the point. The point is that this is the kind of reasoning that persuaded people in the absence of evidence, that this became evidence in and of itself. And I'll be honest, some of these ideas still persist in the academy today, and I don't have time to get into that one, but I do think this is actually still a little more prevalent than we're willing to admit in some of our evolutionary thinking, our tribalist thinking. We don't do it based on race, but we have other things based on, you know, fetal development, you know, somebody who has born with disabilities, those sort of things. And so we take this fitness to survive very seriously today in our naturalistic Darwinian thinking. Okay. So these are just the 8 reasons. I'll kind of put them up here at the end. Darwin assumes that the logical possibility as evidence for a physical actuality. Darwin affirms the consequence. He denies the antecedent. Darwin's argument is self-refuting. Darwin commits the science of the gaps fallacy. Darwin's gambit ignores the mounting evidence. Darwin's thinking really undermines scientific reasoning, and Darwin trusted in morally flawed reasoning. So those are my 8 arguments, I think, where flawed reasoning and that sort of Darwinian naturalism. So with that, I'll leave this up in case somebody has a question about a specific slide, but we can go to any kind of Q&A we have.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a great presentation. Now we have time for questions. Anyone either in the room or on Zoom want to ask a question?
Well, I just have a comment. Are you familiar with the book that was published by Discovery Institute, Darwin Comes to Africa?
Yeah, I read that. I was still actually finishing up my PhD when that got finally published. And I think I might have a footnote or 2 in there, but I really dove into it after. It might have been, I know it was actually after. I think it was after my PhD. But anyway, I've read that recently. It's really well done. It was a really interesting study of Nigeria and how the northern and southern parts of Nigeria. Was in Nigeria a decade ago, and it's really interesting to see how the South and North were so different then and how the impact on that today. That's great. It's a great book. I recommend it. Did you have a thought about that book in particular? Or just...
Well, it just confirms what you said, that Darwin, well, it was used by the Nazis for setting up their, extermination camps. And it really has affected us. Darwin and communism are 2 of the most destructive philosophies in the world today, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and if anybody else is like, so Richard Weikart has done the significant amount of work on Hitler and Darwin kind of connection. He's written multiple books on that. Richard was actually a reader for my PhD. I convinced them to be a part of that to make sure I wasn't doing anything really stupid when I wrote. Although my focus was on American side of things, on the United States, his was really Darwin in Germany, but yeah, he's a brilliant guy, and his stuff on that, if anybody's interested in exploring some of the depths, his most recent book is a little more, less technical and a little more accessible. But his older book, it's harder to find his older book because it was way more academic, and they stopped publishing those things sometimes. But he's written some good stuff.
Well, just another point then. Neo-Darwinism or Darwinist, agreed with the weaknesses in Darwin. And so as I understand it, the neo-Darwinists decided to come up with a stronger argument. But now today, I've been reading that the neo-Darwinists are kind of fading away, and they're looking for a new level of Darwinian thought.
Yeah, that's kind of that headline I showed you earlier. Like, we need a sort of, radical revolution in our theories, because, I've talked to some folks that are, the deeply PhD science guys. A lot of them are a part of Reasons to Believe. When we do our discussions with our scholars community, those sort of things. But I know in other fields, and other groups, Discovery Institute folks have made these observations as well. They go to some of these conferences, and quietly behind the scenes, there are a lot of scientists who are like, yeah, this theory is irredeemable, but they can't give it up. One, because a lot of their grant money, a lot of their writing, a lot of their status depends on advocating for it. And so it's funny. So when you read a lot of these articles, it's really hilarious once you start to pick it out. But I know when I was doing the research for my PhD, although it wasn't really, I dealt with some of the science stuff, but I read a lot of stuff that just because it go down the rabbit hole, right? So I read a lot of these journal articles dealing with genetic stuff, especially. And it's funny because in the intro, it'll say, blah, 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 this scientific study, and a lot of jargon, and, the conclusion, which reinforces evolutionary concepts, is like a throwaway line. But then you read the article and it's like, evolutionary theory has nothing to do with any of the, like, this theory is, their discovery is equally valid within a creation framework as it would be in an evolutionary framework. So the discovery is neutral as to the theory, but they have to say the throwaway line, and this affirms our evolutionary thinking because that's just built into the system. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're stuck with.
Well, I think what you're saying about scientists and science working against itself is really, Stephen Meyer wrote his book, Signature of the Cell, which is probably one of the most scientifically documented books that I've read, well, except for Hugh Ross's most recent book. But in this book, I mean, he shows, here's a point, here's the evidence, here's the point, here's the evidence.
Yeah.
And yet, even though he shows statistically and he uses all of science's arguments to show science has got it wrong, and he still is ignored.
Yeah. That's the power of worldview, and I teach in that field of worldview, and, confirmation bias, the need to maintain our own world system, regardless of the evidence, is far more important than the evidence, right? Because we can't deal with that. And that means apologetically, the way, we do stuff like this in this context, we go to somebody like Francis Schaeffer, and he talked about like that everybody, every man, every woman has built around themselves a shelter to protect them from the reality of what is. And our obligation is to, tear off the roof, remove the shelter, so that they're exposed to the reality, that they're sort of beaten by the reality. So they're just exposed to the elements of the real world, and they're forced to face what is the reality of the world that I've shielded myself from. And so I like to think of that in the sense that, when we're talking about these ideas with people, we should be praying for them at the same time. God, what can I say to get through this? Because they've built a shelter. They've built something around themselves. And because they are predicated on so much false reasoning, I can't reason them out. You can't reason somebody out of bad reasoning, because there's a reason it's bad reasoning. They accept it as true. So you can't have facts when anti-facts are truth for them. So what you have to do is, hopefully through dialogue and debate, you pray that God, let your spirit convict their heart. Let your spirit, soften them in some way, so that something I says can expose them to the reality of what is. But really, I do think even in our sciences, this is going to have to be a work of the Holy Spirit and the work of God transforming people because of their commitment to a no God world.
Joe?
Yes.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I worked in Berkeley at the Center for Science and Theology, and
Oh boy.
got to talk with a lot of different scientists all over the world that were doing work, but they had to hide. They had to have secret meetings, because if anybody found out what they were doing, they would lose their money. Do you think that is what's driving this, that they're not able to get out of this hole of evolution has to be the answer, or else I don't get the money? I mean, what worldview is it supporting? Because you just said the atheist is the enemy of science. I was thinking that it just supports the atheist viewpoint, and that's what they want to keep holding on to.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. It's they're trying to confirm their worldview. I mean, you have to think about what happens is, if your entire worldview is predicated on there is no God, I'm accountable to no one, I am my own maker, right? I drive my own life. And the science points to the fact that their nature does not explain nature. There is some, even if it's not the God of the Bible, there's something that made us. Well, if I start going down that rabbit hole, then I've got to know, who is that God? What could he be like? Is the Christian God now in play, where I've lived my life assuming the Christian God was not real? And so, this gets us to Romans, that, the Apostle Paul tells us that in the end, people are going to be confounded by their own wisdom, or confused by God turns them over to the lust of their desires, and they're confused by their own wisdom. I was a kid, and I always never understood, like, how do you get confused by wisdom? That makes no sense. Like, what does that mean? But then you look at the world around us, and you see that, like, people are so committed to ideas, they can't even see the consequences of their idea. And they can't see that one thing logically leads to the next, because if they were to admit that there's a causal connection, they'd have to change the commitments. And they don't want to change the commitments, so they deny the causality. And that's why it's anti-science.
Yeah.
It really goes back to Hume's idea, right? Hume questioned causality. We'll never know what causal forces are, right? And that's really where we're at with this sort of atheism, is that you have to at some point start to deny the science because you don't want to acknowledge causality. Yeah.
It's curious. It seems like Darwin, it continues to be revered in the scientific community. I mean, it's more, even though we can see all this evidence that Darwinian thinking is flawed and the scientific evidence is building up against it. And I wonder why that is. He almost seems to be the apostle of atheism, maybe one of the horsemen of the atheist movement, where that he was able to help break this theological understanding of science. And is that why do you think he's revered, or is there some other reason?
Darwin now is a stand-in. He's an idol. From a Christian perspective, we say it's idolatry, it's idol worship. He doesn't, the Darwin that's celebrated today isn't even the Darwin who existed, because when you talk to scientists, they say, well, Darwin got X wrong, he got all these things wrong. You can find tons of articles about it. And then that's where atheists come back and say, well, we don't accept what Darwin said. You're quoting his book, and no one believes that. But that's not true. You read the literature, Darwin's ideas were brilliant. Darwin was the revolutionary that brought us the brilliant age. So they play both sides of it when it's convenient for the argument. It's an argument of convenience. But ultimately, Darwin, is just a reflection of the modern imagination. We've remade Darwin in our own image of what society wants him to be, right? What we need him to be. So we have to say that, because here's the thing is, you want to say that, these ideas have been proven, factual evidence for 150 years. See, we have history on our side. We've never had, Darwin was always right. Well, except for everywhere he's wrong, but that doesn't mean that he's always right. So you have to make these appeals because they think that gives weight to their ideas. They want to admit, yeah, well, he was wrong. And the 75 iterations of Darwin's ideas were wrong in between now and then, but this time I'll get it right. So I think there's just a need to have him be the stand and the idol of stability, even when the ideas keep changing.
Hi. One thing that really surprised me was your last point on basically it's a racism argument that I had never heard that one before. So thank you very much for bringing that up. One thing that I remember, I believe it was Ken Samples was talking once about how the younger generation now, it used to be that apologetics was about truth and speaking what, trying to come up with arguments of why Christianity is true. And he said, I believe it was him, he was saying that now the apologetics needs to be shifting more toward why Christianity is good, because there's a lot of people who think Christianity is evil. And I think that last argument that you posed, I think could have a lot more weight than maybe what us in this room, because we're all kind of used to thinking the old way. We might not realize how important that last argument might be to the younger generation, because you talk to people and they really don't really want to think about logical things. They always want to think about what's good and bad. And they make very quick judgments against Christianity.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually, so that last slide is connected to my entire PhD work, was in this idea of Darwin, racism and stuff. So my premise of my thesis was that historical Adam and Eve as sole biological progenitors of every living human is the best argument, the most coherent argument against racism and for racial reconciliation. Outside of that argument, the farther away you get from historical Adam and Eve as sole biological progenitors, which is RTB's position, the farther you move away from that, whether it's a form of theistic evolution or outright, Darwinian naturalism, the farther you get away from that biblical position, the less grounds you have to make that argument that it's wrong. Now you're only arguing about preference. My preference is that we shouldn't do that, but you have no moral foundation to actually objectively, transculturally, transpolitically object to those things. And so when I started writing that, I never knew if I'd be able to prove it or demonstrate it, but I spent about 11 years trying to write it together. But I did it specifically, like you were saying, for the younger generation, because they are persuaded by those emotional arguments, those feeling arguments, but they don't care about what the Bible says. So I tried to take an issue they cared about and said, okay, what does the Bible really say about this? And I think that apologetically has to be a shift that we take in this. It's not that evidences and truths and facts, evidential apologetics is dead. It's still going to be necessary. It's always going to be necessary. But the shelter that they've built around themselves mean they're immune to facts. They're immune to evidence. So we have to have a different, as you're saying, Ken Samples does talk about that. We have to have that different approach to put the chinks in the shelter, to make the cracks in the roof, right? And once we bit the cracks and the Holy Spirit starts working and softening, then evidence will then matter again.
Yes, I
and
agree.
that's when we still need to be prepared with the evidence. So it's both and. It's just the starting point, I think, is shifted, if that makes sense.
And relativity kind of made that path occur. We've had this whole season from modernity to post-modernity.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We got another question here, I think.
Yeah.
Doctor, have you done any work with the latest information from the Webb telescope?
No, I don't do a lot with astronomy, cosmology stuff. I've read a little bit, enough to be dangerous probably, but I'll leave that stuff to Hugh.
Well, it's shooting holes in evolution left and right. So
As far as cosmic evolution or?
and the Big Bang
Oh,
and
okay.
planets that aren't planets, they're not suns, but they're not planets, and so on and so on. It goes.
Yeah.
All
There's big shifts. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, but before I want to hear what you're going to say, but I was going to say, in my heart, Pluto is still a planet, right? I don't care what they say. And my truth is Pluto is still a planet. So that's all that matters. But anyway, finish your point.
Well, they're having problems with black holes now. Black holes are not really black holes, and there's all kinds of things that are coming from the Webb telescope that just shoot down this evolutionary theory. And
they change the time too.
yeah, some of them want to change the time from 13.7 billion years of evolution and now to 27 billion. But that's being suppressed. Oh, we can't go to 27 billion. We got to stay at 13.7 billion years in the universe.
Yeah.
But
there's a lot of challenges.
It's totally ridiculous. I used to be an avid evolutionist coming out of UC Berkeley.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I could change anyone's mind, but now it's bunk and bonkers and drives me insane when people try to use the evolutionary theory, but that's me.
Well, what you bring up, though, although it's not my field, but I do think it's so important because this is what RTB is still able to do and still able to leverage both, the, astronomy, cosmology, but the biology, and then with, the philosophers and the thinkers who are then trying to learn and be interdisciplinary, we're able to shape these arguments into a three-legged stool of theology, philosophy, and science that bolsters, the core argument that we're trying to make. And we're playing catch up on the science side. We've done really well on the philosophy side. The problem is a lot of Christians are giving up on the theology side. They're trying to, say, well, the Bible doesn't really say what it has to say because they're trying to accommodate the secular science. Which is unfortunate because it's right at a time when if we stand firm to the truth of Scripture, the science is pointing our way. And so if we stop trying to curry favor with the world and stand firm, I think we're in an amazing position to win some of these arguments. We just need some of our leaders being a little less afraid to be isolated from the academy.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Another question I have is, it seems like this idea of slow natural selection has long since gone away in terms of the critical thinking. I mean, they're talking about punctate evolution and even, origin of life, transpermia of seeding from other planets and so forth. But yet, that those sort of things don't sort of dethrone this idea of natural selection. It seems like that's still, at least in the common knowledge, I don't, maybe not amongst researchers that are actually doing the work, but it seems like that's still out there. And is there a good reason for that? Is that just because of that kind of reverence for Darwin, the kind of the apostle of naturalism, that you don't want to insult him or put a question mark on the theory in general? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly they don't want a question mark on the theory in principle. Like they don't want a question mark on the word evolution, right? They can change the theory, they can change the mechanisms. You'll see that written a lot where, certainly the mechanisms, we've matured in our understanding and we've deepened in the mechanisms of what that is, but natural selection is still true. Evolution is still true, even though the explanatory power has completely, just fallen off the cliff. So they need new theories, new mechanisms, right? But they still want to use the word because the word represents their worldview. And ultimately, this is a worldview commitment, a fundamental commitment. There is no God, right? And if you start with that, that's why I do that argument, of affirming the consequence and affirming, confirming the antecedent. It's like, it all begins with, well, there's no God, therefore this explains it. Well, this explains it, therefore there's no God. And that's still their thinking. And this is why this talk I think is really important, is because we have to realize that the reasoning is invalid. They're using invalid structured arguments. And so you're not going to disprove it with valid sound reasoning, because they are not interested in valid sound reasoning. And I'm talking broadly many. I mean, clearly many people are. So I don't mean to broad brush every person who thinks this way. There's clearly some who, I think especially younger people, are way more open to this than older scientists might be, who have spent a lifetime investing in this one thing. I do think there is far more hope in the next generation that they will see these issues. But to your point, though, is that what they're blinded to is their worldview commitment to know God blinds them to evidences. And until they are willing to take off the blinders, and that, I believe, is the work of God and the Holy Spirit that we have to be praying for when we're talking with people, not argue them in, but to pray them in. And then once they are open, then the arguments will start to make sense, because there's an openness. But yeah, I just think that it comes down to that fundamental worldview commitment. There is no God, and they're going to do anything they can to maintain that. Yeah. And by the way, that's just no different. That's no different than in the Old Testament. I mean, remember when God promised to Abraham that, your descendants are going to possess this land. It wasn't until 600 years later. But why did he not possess it right away? He said, because God said, look, the people of this land, they still have an opportunity. I'm giving them an opportunity to repent. I'm giving them a chance to change. So he gave them 600 years as a civilization. They didn't do it. So eventually he says, fine, my people are coming in. Bam, they're going to take out the land. They wipe out the Canaanites. Why? Because for 600 years, they refused to repent of their sin. Again, Paul talks about people darkened by, the desires of their flesh and all these things. Their minds are darkened. They're confounded by their own wisdom. This is the nature of sin, and what it does, it blinds us. We want to deny God. And so I think in all of our dialogue of science, we shouldn't forget, we're talking about human beings, people that are made in the image of God, but yet have suppressed the truth for their own ends. And so this is fundamentally the starting point we have to have with them.
Yes, thank you. That's a very salient point. It's very important.
Thank you.